Adam, occasionally we see situations where employees start to do and act outside of their normal role. And sometimes this is for the good of the company, and sometimes it's not. Can you kind of talk about this, about how, as an owner of a company, how you manage like what your employees can and can't do?
So this is an interesting area, just because, once you start growing your organization to the point where you have different tiers, different levels of employees, and you start bringing in managers, some of those managers begin to act as if they're the authority for the organization, and perhaps even trusted them this way with the authority to make certain decisions. Perhaps you have not. And I think the key for the ownership team, or the C-suite, let's say, is to address what level of authority that you're giving to middle management. I'll just call it middle management. What decisions can these managers make on behalf of the organization? Which decisions can they not? Because if you're not making those distinctions clear to the managers, they may begin to do things which bind the organization that you never intended for them to do. Because, there's a lot of case law out there, and this is kind of like an agency theory, which talks about how a manager's actions, good or bad, can be a reflection on the organization's position. So this, just giving an example in the employment context, if you have a manager who, I guess, whether entrusted or not with hiring and firing employees, well, if that manager fires somebody, let's say because that manager just didn't like that person's skin color or person's gender, or because that person had a medical condition, and the ownership team, or let's say the C-suite, had no idea about that, okay, well, that manager's actions can then lead to like a wrongful termination lawsuit. So I think the key with this discussion is to, number one, make it clear to your managers what they can and cannot do, what decisions they can make on their own, what decisions they have to run up the chain. And then number two is have training with respect to the decisions that they can make. So if you are entrusting, for example, a manager to hire and fire or how to pay people, you need to make sure that they're trained on how to do these things in a legally compliant way, or else you could be exposing your company to liability.
Right, because
So
from the perspective of the employee or an outsider, somebody who's managed by that manager, like they don't know what the authority is. How are they going to know that, like, oh, you don't have the authority to fire me, or any of that stuff, or know that it's not a company wide mandate? And then outside the company, if you have employees making large purchases, there's no way that an outside person is going to know, oh, that's not authorized. And so if you're not watching that, you're bound by it because your company is allegedly benefiting from it. So yeah, that gets to be, there's a lot to watch there.
yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point in terms of the outside authority. And, I was talking more from, an internal perspective, but even externally, just to your point, if let's say you have a manager who's entering into contracts on behalf of the company, or structuring deals on behalf of the company, when let's say they had no authority to do so, well, this third party with whom they're entering into a deal with is going to assume that this manager has that authority, right? And there's no way for that third party to know really the inner workings without essentially being disclosed of that information. So yeah, there's a whole host of problems that can come from essentially this gap of information of what these managers can and cannot do. So make sure you address that gap early on.